Lake Erie is the canary in the coal mine for the Great Lakes.
The whole lake is green. As far as the eye can see, the water's green.
It's scary what I see. You sit on your boat for 20 minutes and your eyes will start to burn.
What needs to happen is for there to be real accountability.
That was a preview for the Erie Situation, a new documentary about harmful algal blooms in Lake Erie, but also an environmental issue in many, many states and countries around the world. Thanks for joining me in this live watch party. I'm Sandra Svoboda, the program director of Great Lakes Now. We are having this watch party in advance of a very special airing of the Erie Situation documentary. It is Monday, September 12th, as we are talking, and at 9 p.m. Eastern tonight, there are 6 PBS stations around the Great Lakes region that are airing this program simultaneously. If you live in Marquette, Michigan, Detroit, Michigan, Toledo, Ohio, Cleveland, Erie, Pennsylvania, or Buffalo, New York, you can catch the full hour-long documentary on your station at 9 p.m. This is a one-time only airing. You can't see the documentary anywhere else right now. But let me introduce the filmmaker for it, David J. Ruck, who can maybe tell us. David, hi, welcome to Great Lakes Now. Are people going to be able to see this documentary anywhere else, or is this the one time they can see it right now that's scheduled?
Well, great question. So we're working with you to expand the reach of this film via the PBS network. We've got a number of private event screenings set up. We have a number of film festivals that we're still going to be hitting this fall season. And then we expect this to exist on an online streaming platform to be named in the future. So this isn't your one and only opportunity. This is a 60-minute version of a 72-minute film that's been cut down to fit into a broadcast hour.
Right. So
yeah.
We are going to come back with more specifics in the film, but I just want to get people a little hyped up to watch it at 9 o'clock tonight on one of those 6 stations, if they will. David, we're going to come back to you in just a minute to talk more about harmful algal blooms, but I want to introduce the other 2 guests that we have now live in this watch party, where you, the audience, can ask questions about what you're seeing. So first, let me introduce Julie Anderson. She's the CEO of Plastic Oceans International. Julie, thanks for joining us from California.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
And then finally, last but not least, we have Bryan Stubbs, who's the CEO and president of the Cleveland Water Alliance. They're on Lake Erie as well. Bryan, welcome to your first Great Lakes Now watch party.
Happy to be here. I'm excited and a big fan of Dave, so this is great.
All right. Well, we are going to come back with Julie to talk more about how the algal blooms are a big problem internationally and why an international nonprofit is interested here in the Lake Erie film. And then Bryan will join us in a little bit to talk about what's going on in Cleveland relative to problems with water, not only in Lake Erie, but then solutions worldwide. But let me start with David. David, we have a little bit of a clip from the film here. It's called Lake Erie is Green. Does that sum up why you were interested in this documentary to begin with?
I would say that the color of the lake was a real strong indicator based on my experience in the other Great Lakes that something was wrong, something was different there. And Ed Verhamy, who's in the film, he's an environmental engineer, was kind of explaining to me that this was an existing problem, a problem that he was working on at Limnotech and now Freeboard Technology. And it really, from that relationship, just sort of, sparked my interest in wanting to learn more about it and explore the nitty gritty details of what was going on, what was being done or not being done about it. But certainly when you see Lake Erie in full bloom during the bloom season, it is striking.
Yeah. So let's roll that first clip. It's about 30 seconds long. Audience, remember, we do like to hear where you're watching from tonight, but also if you have any questions. So let's look at just a quick tidbit from the full-length film.
So as we look around us right now, the whole lake is green. Everywhere you look, you can see some collections of green scum that's collecting together with the wind we're seeing right now. But I mean, as far as the eye can see, the water's green. And if you look real close, you can actually see the algal colony. You can actually see the algal cells in the water. It's not like a dye or a stain. It's the water's green because all the algae are there and living there. And the bloom here goes out about 12 miles offshore.
So we actually heard from Ed on one of our Facebook pages where he's watching tonight and said this is a great opportunity, I assume, for people to be learning more about the problem. So David, let's frame it up. When we talk about harmful algal blooms, toxic algae in Lake Erie, what is it and what is its impact on people?
It is one of the earliest life forms on the planet. It is cyanobacteria. Cyanobacteria is not by itself a bad thing. We have cyanobacteria to thank for oxygenating the planet, for giving us photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria on its own is actually a really fascinating life form. It's in every corner of the earth. It's not just Lake Erie. I mean, if you pick up a rock in the desert, you'll probably find some cyanobacteria of some form living under that rock. It is, almost literally everywhere. It's the kind of thing that we might look for as we explore other exoplanets or Europa when we're trying to, understand if life exists there. So cyanobacteria is a really important part of our planet, but it can also lead to big problems if there's too much of it. Cyanobacteria kind of took over the planet, and as a waste product, it gives off oxygen, and kind of like we give off CO2, right? So if we all exhaled enough CO2 to suddenly turn the atmosphere into CO2, we'd probably all start coughing and eventually suffocate. Well, that's what the oxygen did for most of the cyanobacteria, and it shrunk down to levels that you don't really notice it that often, unless you're in really unique environments typically. But when you give it some food, like agricultural runoff coming from the Maumee River into the western basin of Lake Erie, and you combine that especially with warm water temperatures, maybe calm water, then an organism that would probably be in the water anyway is gonna proliferate. So as far as it relates to human health impacts, if it's a toxic bloom, as you'll see in the film, it can have impacts on any number of systems, especially folks with pre-existing conditions, asthma. If you're out on the lake for extended periods of time and there's a bloom happening, especially one that's quite visible, you could this can aerosolize. You might be breathing these things. So it really all depends on the kind of exposure, the length of exposure, the type of exposure. Did you drink it? Did you breathe it? And it could definitely lead to health impacts. We know pets, especially, which jump in the lake and drink the water. If it's a bad enough bloom, you got about an hour to get your pet to the vet before no more phyto. So it's a serious thing.
Yeah. We have a clip from one of the people you met in the film. Let's see that clip and then tell us a little bit about this gentleman and the health impacts that he suffered. Let's roll that.
I was spending 4 days a week here on the water, either motoring my boat up into just looking at stuff, not anymore. I stopped coming out here because it seemed like every time I was out here, I would get respiratory problem,
If you're just joining this watch party, it's a preview of the Erie Situation documentary, which is airing on 6 PBS stations this evening. If you're watching this later, it is September 12th. But at 9 o'clock tonight on 6 PBS stations. You can see that full-length documentary. I'm Sandra Svoboda with Great Lakes Now. We cover these issues a lot in Great Lakes Now. We've had work in our show and on our website at greatlakesnow.org, news about these algal blooms. So I want to go back to David J. Ruck. He's the filmmaker and principal of the Erie Situation, but we're going to meet somebody in a moment who helped out with the film. But David, this is our chance to talk to you and for the audience to ask questions a little bit behind the scenes with the documentary filmmaker. So tell us about that gentleman, that clip that we just saw.
So one of the things that I've done in the past, and it's partially just to light a fire under myself, is I start a Facebook page for the film that I want to make or the film that I'm working on, as sort of a way to keep myself moving and accountable. You know, like I'm working on this thing, and then magically by me putting it out there publicly, then I can't stop working on it, right? But one of the things that started happening as I was posting pictures along the way making this film is I started getting messages from folks in the Toledo area, and one of them was this gentleman Ken Sabin, who kept sending me videos, asking questions, and long story short, we eventually met up with him. I think he thought we were going to give him a lecture or a presentation on what was happening in his lake. And I was like, no, I'm really interested in what your perspective is. You live here, you sail here, this is your community. He's in the Point Place area. And really Ken is sort of representative of people that live around the lake. You know, like since the water crisis, they've figured out how to treat this water coming out of your tap. But that does nothing for people who live next to it and rely on it. People who are maybe breathing it. You know, in Point Place, you got the Ottawa and the Maumee River on both sides. And in 2019, that bloom was, because of wind conditions, was pushed right up in the river on both sides. So, I wanted to talk to Ken because I wanted to know what somebody in his situation or living in that type of proximity to algae blooms on an annual basis, what they thought about that and what impact that had on their life, their livelihood, their friends and neighbors, and very quickly realized that Ken was he had an important story to tell.
Yeah. So speaking of people, I want to check in here. We've got some hellos. Ken says, hey, Dave, Ken Sabin. We have Tara watching from Buffalo, New York, Laura from Erie, Pennsylvania, Kay in Canton, Ohio, Kara in West Michigan, Heather in Vermilion, Ohio, a lot of people around Lake Erie and also the other Great Lakes areas. You mentioned the water crisis, and I assume you mean Toledo in 2014 when these blooms actually shut down the drinking water system. Is that what got your attention for the film, or it was really more than that? It sounds like maybe it was some of the human stories as well.
Well, as I'm learning about algae blooms in Lake Erie, mostly through Ed and people I was meeting through the scientific community in the Great Lakes area, folks that were studying it. People then talk about the water crisis, the Toledo water crisis, where there was a EPA order to shut the water system down to, don't drink in it, don't drink it, don't bathe in it, basically have no contact with the water coming out of your faucet. Because the water plant was caught unaware that this was happening. So, that's something that made national news. That was on CNN, that was on ABC News, nightly news. This was a very big deal that a town, a big city, 600,000 plus people had to, were ordered not to touch the water coming out of their faucet for about 72 hours. So, that was a big deal. And then combine that, that was 2014. I'm working on the film, primarily shooting it in 2019. It's still freaking awful out there. So clearly, okay, so the water treatment plant is now ready for if that stuff comes in the plant, but clearly nothing was being done to mitigate, to reduce these blooms as they were happening. So water crisis, one thing, being able to trust water coming out of your tap is one thing, but are we actually solving the problem of these recurring blooms in the lake on an annual basis? And that was a definite no.
Yes. So we have one comment. We're going to get to Julie in just a moment to talk about this more as a global issue. Julie Anderson with Plastic Oceans. There is the preview every year. How bad can we expect the blooms to be on Lake Erie? So David in Clyde, Ohio said he has been seeing it at North Bass Island in Lake Erie, but it doesn't seem as concentrated in past years. So David, this is kind of something, maybe we're going to go back a little bit in time of our what should be our timeline for this watch party. You talked about how the algae is sort of prevalent. It's part of life forms and, across the planet. What makes it a problem? What is causing the toxic algae blooms in Lake Erie that are mucking up drinking water, poisoning the water enough that we have advisories for pets drinking it, swimming in it, can smell it out boating, and the health impacts that Ken has? What is causing it?
So in a lot of places outside Lake Erie, especially smaller lakes, algae blooms might be driven by, folks putting fertilizer down in their yard, or bad septic systems. Unfortunately, this is still a thing that you hear with regard to Lake Erie from folks who don't really understand what's going on. The Ohio EPA, not the Ohio Department of Agriculture, the Ohio EPA is saying that about 90% of the phosphorus, which is the main driver for algal blooms in Lake Erie, is coming from agricultural runoff. So in the case of Western Lake Erie, the food source for the cyanobacteria is coming from farmlands. In fact, if you want to talk about manure, on the Maumee watershed alone, there's enough animal waste produced that's about equivalent to this. Imagine the cities of Chicago and Los Angeles combined, that they're producing that amount of waste, basically untreated, that's either used as a form of fertilizer or it's over applied to fields and then runs off as waste. So the answer to your question is agricultural runoff.
All right, we have a couple of quick clips I want to show. I think we have two there. So Tammy, our technician behind the scenes tonight, could you run both of those?
So phosphorus is just one of those things that we need to apply to soil to make sure that we get good crop growth. Turns out if you apply something to the soil that can run off, algae, even cyanobacteria, they're not all that different from the plants you're trying to encourage to grow. And if that stuff runs off and gets into a lake, they're encouraged to grow too. And those situations, when you get a lot of runoff, that's when you start to see big algae blooms.
The only way that we know about them and have evidence for them is through their permits. Now, these permits require the facilities to report how many animals they have and how much manure the animals generate each year and what they do with the manure, but only to a certain extent, and only the facilities that are above a certain threshold. So if you have 2,500 pigs, which can generate over 1 million gallons of manure each year, you have to have a permit by state law. But if you have 2,400, you don't have to have a permit.
Those were two more clips from the documentary, The Erie Situation. We've been chatting with David J. Ruck, the producer of that film that airs at 9 p.m. tonight on 6 PBS stations in the Lake Erie region and one up in Lake Superior, WNMU there in Marquette, because they are having trouble with algal blooms on Lake Superior as well. I'm Sandra Svoboda with Great Lakes Now. We cover issues like algal blooms and other news about the Great Lakes on our monthly TV show and our webpage. And I'd like to bring in now a new guest, a new partner for Great Lakes Now, Julie Anderson with Plastic Oceans International out in California, a nonprofit, one of the co-producers of the film. Julie, welcome back.
Thanks, Andy. It's great to be here. I'm really excited.
Yeah. So I wonder, as you're listening to all of this, and our audience there on Facebook and on YouTube tonight is thinking, this is the Great Lakes. We're seeing a film about the Great Lakes, but you are an international nonprofit. I'm going to ask you why algae blooms in a moment, but tell us more about Plastic Oceans for people who are not familiar.
Well, Plastic Oceans is a international nonprofit. Our mission is to end plastic pollution, and we do so by recognizing that plastic pollution is a complex global problem that really needs to be solved by building and fostering sustainable communities. And we educate on different matters around water security and related issues about water security in order to build build sustainable communities to end plastic pollution.
Yeah, Ernie, who is hearing our message, and one of the Facebook pages says, "OMG, so tragic and sad. This will take another 100 years to clean up." And we also had, let me find his name, Dweeb Zoid, who points out that Allegheny State Park in New York was closed for swimming in the past because of algal blooms there on an inland lake. So, Julie, that you're international Oceans NGO, why this Great Lakes documentary for you?
A couple of reasons. One, it is being called Plastic Oceans. People always assume that this is an issue for those that live near the ocean. And one of the early on, we had films that had raised the awareness about how plastic pollution is everywhere. It's inland, it's in our rivers, it's in our lakes, and many of our lakes are connected to our oceans. And for the Great Lakes, they're connected to the Atlantic through the St. Lawrence River, and there's also a man-made one through the Mississippi. And the reason I had come across this because part of our mission was, well, how do we get individuals to reduce their single-use plastic water bottle usage? And we had a initiative that had gone around wanting to implement or install different refill stations at schools. However, it was incredible to learn how difficult it was to put these refill stations into different schools around the Great Lakes, because those refill stations, even though they filter potable water. And it was shocking to see that the potability of a lot of towns around the Great Lakes were just not at the level that could even filter using these refill stations. And then that further went to really look into what is wrong with Great Lakes, what was problematic about Great Lakes, and finding out that this is something that is affecting the world. And a lot of Great Lakes lakes are suffering agrochemical runoff, and it's a water security issue. Plastic pollution is a water security issue. How do we then target complex problems that require multiple solution approaches? And, as Ernie pointed out, this will take 100 years, but it'll take that much longer if we are cleaning up one chemical at a time, one plastic at a time. Can we start to think more systems approach to be able to solve multiple problems while we're doing cleanup?
Julie, I'm going to bring in our third guest in just a moment. He is going to talk more about some of the work that is being done on Lake Erie that can be applied worldwide. But I want to ask you one more question. Pick your brain a little bit. We know that our audience has a lot of advocates, environmentalists, teachers, parents. What are some strategies that you have found useful for getting people to understand these issues and take action?
One of the main strategy is really to talk about the life cycle of plastic, or the journey of plastic, and that there are multiple stakeholders along that journey of plastic, from the producers to the consumers to the local governments that are now tasked with cleanups and managing the end of life. And another approach is understanding that life cycle, that journey of plastic, is understanding that each stakeholder holds different accountability and responsibility. And that understanding is then applied to how do we then regulate, or incentivize better regulations to hold different stakeholders accountable appropriately.
All right. Thank you for that. Julie, we're going to have you stand by if anybody in the audience has some questions for you. But right now, I want to introduce Bryan Stubbs. We met him at the beginning briefly, but he is with the Cleveland Water Alliance. So, Bryan, you get to be the kind of solutions guy here in this watch party. But so tell us what the Cleveland Water Alliance does as a group. Why did you form? And then what solutions are you working towards not only on Lake Erie, but solutions that are practical for other places around the world. And then I have some audience questions for you. But let's get to know Cleveland Water Alliance first.
Thank you, and thanks for having us here tonight. So we've always said that Lake Erie is the canary in the coal mine, and by that meaning, first of all, a lot of people who aren't from this region don't realize how much fresh water, surface fresh water, the Great Lakes are. More than 20% of the world's fresh surface water. And in the United States, that's 80+% of the United States world fresh surface water, or US's fresh surface water. And then you take that to the Great Lakes scale and you realize, these massive Great Lakes, but Lake Erie is only 2% of that water, but it's 50% of the biodiversity of the Great Lakes. So because of that, when something goes south, when something goes wrong, it goes wrong usually in Lake Erie first. So thus, Lake Erie is the canary in the coal mine. So, over the years, between the Cuyahoga River burning, last most infamously in '69, covered by Time magazine, Lake Erie being called dead in the early '70s. But out of that came some exciting, opportunities, and that includes the formation of the U.S. EPA, the Clean Drinking Water Act, et cetera. And out of that also came a lot of people who wanted to create solutions. So in Greater Cleveland, we have over 300 companies that we call, water economy companies. They're all working on various water solutions. Now it's broad. It's not just Lake Erie. We've got companies working on reducing microplastics in the home. We've got, companies.
Oh, we just lost Bryan's audio. So I'm going to let him check his settings there quickly, see if something went awry. I'll check in with a few audience questions. Dina wants to know if any of the 6 stations that are airing the program tonight have it available for online viewing, only in their viewing areas. For example, I'm actually in Milwaukee right now for a water conference, so I cannot watch it. It's not airing here, and I'm out of the viewing area. But PBS stations, if you're in the area of any of the 6 tonight, Tammy, can we throw that map back up here and remind people where they can watch the program tonight at 9 o'clock? If you're in Marquette, Detroit, Toledo, Cleveland, Erie, Pennsylvania, Buffalo, New York, your PBS station at 9 p.m. Eastern Time will be airing this documentary, and you can get it through that station website. They have the online streaming. Kiera has a question about getting another screening of this film. So Kiera, we're going to try to reach out to you on private message in the chat, maybe get your email address. She also asked about continuing support local PBS station and maybe airing it. So yes, we would love to work on that, Kiera. So we will be in touch. We have a question from Chuck. So maybe we could bring, do we have Bryan back, Tammy? Oh, still have an issue. All right, let's David Ruck. We have a question I think that you can answer. If we could bring David. Chuck is wondering if no-till farming makes an impact on reducing fertilizer runoff and how effective it is. We talked about phosphorus and the nutrients in fertilizer and agriculture being a prime driver of the algae bloom. So can no-till farming make a difference towards a solution for this problem?
I think that's a question for someone smarter than I am about the issue. I think you want to probably talk to maybe like Laura Johnson, who's at Heidelberg University, or someone at Ohio State University. I think one of the things to talk about, though, when you're talking about different methods of farming, is like the soil health people. We talk about farming in the film. There's certainly no-till, low-till, styles of farming. It's not all these things are possible on all kinds of soil. And so I think that a lot of folks want to sort of reduce that impact to the soil and use the least amount of tilling that they possibly can, because you're you're disturbing the microbial community. The harder you till the soil, the more you wreck it, and then the more product you're going to have to put on it to sort of kind of replace what you're undoing. It's a really complex, complicated thing to talk about soil and soil health. But the folks that are really taking this seriously, let's just talk about organics for a second. There's people that farm organic, and there are people who farm organic that are soil health people. And while some of those folks might consider, the public might think that just because something is organic, that must mean that they're soil health people. That's not always the case. I don't believe. So I think that, in some places, a lot of folks are trying to go to this strictly no-till style farming. And I think we talked to a person in this film that's trying to convert 5,000 acres of conventional farmland, a couple of 100 acres at a time, from conventional farming to no-till, full organic. But that's in Indiana, and they've got slightly different kinds of soil. So I think that the solution is going to be a little bit different regardless of where you are. But the words to listen for are really like soil health. And if you're over applying nutrients, then you're not really thinking about soil health. If you're over applying manure, that's waste disposal. That's not soil health. So I think, organic is a good place to start, but you kind of also have to go deeper beyond that into, okay, what style of organic, what kind of farming are you doing? And really then the only final measure is to sample what's coming off of that field to determine.
So, David, we have about a 30-second clip of one of the farmers you met while making the documentary, The Erie Situation. I want us to roll that and then tell us a little bit more about him.
Well, let's not even talk about the land. What's your responsibility to your neighbor? And who's your neighbor? Everybody's our neighbor. I mean, this river affects millions of people. Go right to the source. I think a lot of city people don't understand where their food came from. I think a lot of farm people kind of forget where it's going. We just drop it off at the grain leg and get paid, and we're done. Somebody's going to eat this stuff.
So, David, tell us a little bit about that character, so to speak, in terms of the film.
Joe Hammond Organic Farm. He runs a small organic dairy operation in Defiance, Ohio. Just an incredible guy to sit down and talk to, and that's kind of how things began with him. We were recommended by a neighbor on a day when we were driving around all over that part of Ohio, trying to interview farmers, looking for perspectives on farming perspectives on Lake Erie, and folks would point us towards Joe's place. So had a great conversation with Joe. Joe's the kind of guy. He's going to look to the Bible for answers to things that he does. And one of those things that he takes very seriously is taking care of your neighbor. And he believes that part of his job as a farmer in taking care of his neighbor is to take care of the land that he's farming on. And so Joe, from an agricultural standpoint, is a lifelong learner. He's someone he goes to the soil health talks that are put on by Ohio State University or USDA, or he meets with other organic farmers. He's always learning, and I feel like in connecting and talking with Joe, there's probably a lot of things that we can all learn from someone like Joe, someone who works the land, who's doing everything he can to do the next right thing. And really, and this is really key, he's sort of existing outside the farm industrial complex, which starts with the Farm Bill, and subsidies that go towards certain kinds of farming, and which leads to so many of the problems that we have today with our land use, which translates to impacts on the water. Joe works outside of that system. And that's mainly because that system has very little to offer people like Joe, who see the problems that the system has created. Corn, for example, we grow 40% of the corn that we grow is for food and fuel. Well, if you do the math, it makes more environmental sense to simply just drill for oil than it does to grow a food crop as a fuel crop. You're burning diesel to grow the crop and harvest the crop and turn that into alcohol that's then put into fuel, and then you burn that fuel. So there's just a lot of things that are really screwed up with the system from just a practical standpoint, from standing back, like, why are we doing this? And so folks like Joe, who, really trying to do the next right thing, that there's very little in the system that, as we have it set up, to help them. So I thought it was important to talk to Joe, not only about, his theories and perspective on agricultural impacts on the water, but to be pro farmer, we need to eat, right? We have to grow food. What can we learn from someone like Joe in terms of how we might want to be considering raising the food that we need to sustain our society, our families, in a healthy, sustainable way? So that's why Joe's in the film.
All right. Thank you for that, David. I believe we may have Bryan Stubbs back from the Cleveland Water Alliance. Bryan, can you hear me, and can we hear you?
Can you hear me is the bigger question.
There we go. Okay. So I want to let you pick up where David left off. We were talking a few minutes ago about the Cleveland Water Alliance's work towards solutions. So what is the connection between the water quality farmers and action that your group or others in Ohio have taken?
Well, for us, it first of all starts with public health. So let's start the conversation there. When 2014 happened, the Toledo crisis happened, if you will. Everybody rushed out, by everybody meaning NOAA, Ohio EPA, to put up some monitoring systems, and then kind of left. No, understanding of the equipment, that it has to be maintained, it has to be, monitored in its own right. So the first thing is understanding what's going on with our ecosystem. And so to that point, we developed Smart Lake Erie. And basically, just like you have smart cities, and everybody talks about smart cities this and smart cities that, and you see IoT or the Internet of Things ads during the Super Bowl. We took that same kind of topic and spun that into starting with Lake Erie and then going up the watershed so that we can understand the health of our ecosystem and our watershed and our water systems better. So on one hand, we have this public kind of service component, but the flip side is we're using this to kind of streamline accelerating new technologies, new innovations. We talked earlier about, this is a local problem, but it's also a global problem of Lake Erie being the canary in a coal mine. So any solutions we develop, be it on the water or on the land, are going to be in high demand worldwide. There's going to be a market for those solutions. So we started with, bluntly, how can we make, Lake Erie and the supporting watersheds as smart as possible? So these questions of, does this work? Does that not work? And I mean, we're going to hear it all throughout this evening, and that everybody's got an opinion. I love opinions, but I also like data and I like facts. And the more data and facts we have, the more we can pinpoint where the issues are coming from, and to trial new technologies and new solutions to see if they work in a more immediate impact. Not do we have to wait 1 year, 2 years, or 3 years. We're going to have an idea of what's going on with reactive phosphorus, with dissolved phosphorus, more quickly with new innovations and new technologies. So we start there. Of course, we're massively interested in, precision ag. We've been installing all sorts of these crazy gateways on towers and water towers throughout the entirety of the southern Lake Erie, Ohio border. And what these do is allow for sensors, whether it's on land or 20 miles out on Lake Erie, to use these really cheap sensors to be able to tell more information, to help people do more. And, one other thing I just want to say here is, there's ways to treat the water, and that's what Toledo and Port Clinton and others do now, activated carbon. They dump it into the system, but we prefer that they not have to do that. But this also leads to, big water utilities, in the case of Cleveland Water, having issues of hypoxia or oxygen-starved water, which is another legacy of the algal blooms going rampant and pervasive, as Dave said earlier. And, for us, our technology and innovations has created early warning systems on all these topics for these utilities. So the public health utility function comes into play. They can better understand what's coming at them, better treat it, and hopefully solve for it in a more cost-effective way. We just need to take all that now upland in terms of precision ag moving forward.
Yeah. So, Bryan, we have a question from Daniel. He's asking specifically why this happens in Lake Erie and near Toledo. Is it because of the lake depth? And he points out there is agricultural runoff in the other Great Lakes, but he hasn't seen the blooms in this way. So, yes, absolutely right. Part of the reason where so many stations are showing the film and we've had such interest is because algal blooms are, I was looking at headlines last week and I don't know how many states we've seen them in. We have a story on our website where you can go in and track and see where blooms have been reported in other places as well. But getting back to Lake Erie, why specifically the Western Lake Erie Basin as opposed to, say, like Lake St. Clair, which is also a shallow lake with runoff?
Yeah, well, one, you have the Maumee, which is a massive river system that serves a massive amount of farmland. So you have higher concentrations, one. Two, yes, you have shallow waters. Three, you have the impacts of climate change, which is exacerbating this, meaning the water's warmer and that's letting the systems feed more aggressively. So you've got like a perfect storm. I mean, there's always been, as Dave talked about earlier, we've always had algal blooms in Lake Erie. We've had nuisance algal blooms, but this level of harmful algal blooms has just gotten nasty. So it's a combination of, it's getting a lot fed into its diet as a lake in terms of phosphates, phosphorus. It's the shallowest, so it's also the warmest and getting warmer by the year. So it's just this perfect storm of influences between ag and climate change, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to do a couple more audience questions as we're wrapping up. If you have any more questions, please get them in the chat quickly. We just have a few more minutes in this scheduled watch party, and then you'll all have about an hour break before you can view the documentary on your local PBS station. So Sandy Bin says no-till has mixed reviews, but row crop farmers have had some success in reducing phosphorus with other soil health measures, precision ag, cove crops, and other measures. So getting at that whole idea of soil health as well. Greg says Big Creek Connects says hi from Cleveland. They're involved in watershed cleanups and the teaching of students for watershed monitoring. So teach them young is his advice for all of us. Kira says we need more Joe the farmer who cares about the neighbors. Ken as well would like to meet Joe. So let me come back with a final question for each of you. So David, let me start with you. As people are watching your film, what's the one thing you hope they take away and remember and then do?
Yeah, so I'm pretty sure Ken is, when he says need to meet Joe, he's saying everybody needs to meet Joe because he's met Joe.
Okay.
I think
everybody's going to meet Joe in your documentary, right, David?
You're going to meet Joe in the documentary. I think what I really want folks to take away from this is one of the things that Joe says in the film is that you vote with how you want your food grown by how you shop at the grocery store. What are some of the things that you can do? I'm lucky. I live in Muskegon, Michigan. We've got the second largest farmers market, I believe, in the state. It's wonderful. It's open every Saturday, and I think even There may be some folks there on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So I'm pretty fortunate that I can go have a personal relationship with the producers that I buy the bulk of my produce from. And you can ask them, how do you grow this? I think we need to see a shift in larger cities to sort of a more European style of food options, where you've got stands in the street where folks are bringing in food from outside the city, where city folks can buy fresh produce from food stands in the city. My understanding is that's very popular, very common in Europe. So I at the end of the day, though, we need a complete overhaul of the Farm Bill and the way our agricultural system is set up. We've seen from National Geographic articles that an apple grown 100 years ago to an apple grown now, the nutrient value in the apple grown today is far less than it was 100 years ago. And that's pretty much across the board with most of the mass-produced fruits and vegetables and produce that you're going to find. How do we make that better? Well, we make that better by demanding it as consumers. And if a consequence of the farming, the agricultural practices that we have right now are things like Lake Erie, then a consequence of better choices is going to be the opposite of that. We're going to see cleaner lakes, cleaner water, and you can do something about that by voting with how you spend your money.
All right. Let me have Bryan Stubbs follow that up. For audiences watching the Erie Situation, learning more about the issue of algal blooms in Lake Erie and elsewhere, not only in the Great Lakes, but beyond, what do you hope audiences think about after this film and then subsequently do, Bryan?
I hope they feel like I feel, which is there's a lot of people hurting because of this, and this is damaging. This is damaging human health, and this is damaging a regional economy. And that I hope people understand and they get that something needs to be done. This can't be something that's managed from a political standpoint. This is something that needs to be an all hands on deck to solve for. And it's a reminder, Dave's film.
All right, Bryan locked up there, but we will let.
And usually that's a widget or a thing, but we also need to. Did you lose me?
All right, I'm going to go to Julie as we wrap up the watch party here. Julie Anderson is with Plastic Oceans International. Julie, we've gone from Lake Erie to the greater Great Lakes to individual behaviors in many, many ways. What do you see? What gives you hope globally about what's happening and how there may be solutions and betterment of these issues?
This is addressing, it's a complex systems that I think, the takeaway from the film is what Joe said, is that we have to care for our neighbors. We have to learn deeper about our communities. It's not solving the problem like with a Band-Aid. It's deeper problems. This is a water security issue. This is a food security issue. It's a farming issue that starts to affect our economy. So there are all these interconnections, and it is starting to dig a little deeper to start to think of how our communities are being operated and not just Band-Aid solutions, one problem at a time, but really systemically thinking of how we're protecting our communities. And we're starting to see this around the world because we are all interconnected, not only just within our communities, but with the world.
All right. Well, I'd like to close out here by echoing what one of our Facebook audience members said. Laura says, appreciate your work, everyone. I can't say it any better. Julie Anderson with Plastic Oceans International, Bryan Stubbs with the Cleveland Water Alliance, and David J. Ruck with Great Lakes Outreach Media. Julie and David produced the film, The Erie Situation, which airs in just over an hour tonight, if you're watching live, September 12th, on 6 PBS stations around Lake Erie and Marquette, Michigan. We've done some work at Great Lakes Now about Lake Superior algal bloom. So we'll drop that link in the chat as we have with other things. So thank you so much for watching. If you want to see more films like this, please drop us an email, send a message through one of the social media platforms. You can follow us at Great Lakes Now. on Twitter and our Facebook page as well, where you're watching this. So I'm Sandra Svoboda, the program director. Many, many thanks to our guests, you, the audience, who asked some good questions, and Tammy Winsell behind the scenes making this all happen. We'll be joining the broadcast at 9 p.m., the Erie Situation on those local PBS stations. Thank you all so much for making this possible. And as we always say, I'll see you out on the lakes.